Michael Harris was born on a cold morning in March of 1968, at an hour when the world outside his mother's window had not yet decided whether to wake or remain asleep. The town did not greet his arrival with ceremony. There were no church bells, no hurried footsteps in hallways, no voices raised in excitement. Only the wind moved with purpose, sliding between low houses and empty streets, carrying dust from one forgotten corner to another. The town barely existed on maps. It was the kind of place people passed through without noticing, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, their minds already somewhere else. A handful of streets, a small station where trains slowed but rarely stopped for long, buildings built low to the ground, as if they had learned early that drawing attention served no purpose. Even the sky felt closer there, heavy and wide, pressing down on everything beneath it. Michael's first sound was not a cry, but a quiet intake of breath. Mary Harris noticed it immediately. She lay exhausted in the narrow bed, her hair damp with sweat, her body trembling with the effort of bringing new life into a world that had never asked for him. The nurse leaned in, waiting for the expected sound, the sharp announcement of existence, but it did not come. Instead, there was only breathing, steady, present, enough. Mary smiled faintly. "He's listening," she said. The nurse glanced at her, confused, then shrugged. "As long as he's breathing." Mary closed her eyes. She already knew. Henry Harris was not there when his son was born. He was standing along a stretch of railway miles away, his boots planted firmly in gravel, his hands wrapped around a metal tool already warmed by friction and use. The rails hummed faintly beneath his feet, a sound so familiar it had become part of his own internal rhythm. When the message finally reached him hours later, delivered by a man who spoke too loudly in places where loudness felt unnecessary, Henry only nodded. "A boy," he repeated, as if testing the word's weight. That evening he returned home with the same tired eyes he always carried, the same smell of metal and oil clinging to his clothes. He washed his hands carefully at the sink, scrubbing longer than usual, as though trying to remove not dirt but something heavier. When he entered the bedroom, Mary was asleep. The baby lay beside her, wrapped tightly, his face turned slightly toward the window. Henry stood there for a long time. He did not speak, he did not touch the child at first. He simply watched, listening to the quiet breathing that filled the room. It reminded him of the space between trains, the moments when the tracks were empty, when movement paused and the world held its breath. "He's quiet," Henry said finally. Mary opened her eyes. "Yes." They shared a look then, brief but complete. There were many things neither of them knew how to say. Silence had always done that work for them. Michael's childhood unfolded the way the town itself existed, slowly, without urgency, without spectacle. Days were marked not by events, but by repetition. Morning light through thin curtains, the sound of Henry's boots by the door, Mary's movements through the house, steady and purposeful, like a rhythm no one questioned. From a young age, Michael learned the geography of silence. There was the silence of early morning, before the town stirred, when even the wind seemed reluctant to move. There was the silence of late afternoon, heavy with heat and dust, pressing against the windows. And there was the silence of night, deep and layered, filled with distant train whistles and the occasional bark of a dog too far away to feel close. Michael did not fear these silences, he inhabited them. He spent hours near the window, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his knees drawn close. Dust floated in the sunlight, moving slowly enough that he could follow each particle with his eyes. Outside, the world passed without him. Cars moved along the road. People walked by without looking in. Trains cut across the horizon, long and deliberate, their whistles stretching across the land like questions that never expected answers. Michael imagined those trains, carrying entire lives inside them. He imagined people sitting by other windows, watching different skis, wondering about places they had never seen. He imagined departure more than arrival, movement more than destination. Even then, he understood something he would not have words for until much later, that leaving and escaping were not the same thing. Mary watched him from a distance. She never interrupted his stillness. She never asked what he was thinking. Instead, she paid attention to small changes, the way his shoulders tightened when voices grew loud, the way his gaze lingered on things others dismissed. She understood that Michael absorbed the world differently, not loudly, not quickly, but deeply. Strength, she believed, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it sat quietly by a window and watched dust move through light. School arrived like an intrusion. The building was louder than anything Michael had known. Chairs scraped against floors, voices overlapped, bells rang without warning. The world there demanded participation, hands raised, answers spoken quickly, opinions formed before thought had time to settle. Michael learned early that hesitation was mistaken for ignorance. He knew answers but did not rush toward them. He preferred to observe first. He noticed the way children shifted their weight when they lied, the way some teachers softened their voices when they were tired, as if unconsciously asking for kindness. He noticed how certain questions were never asked, how certain topics were avoided with a careful, practiced ease. While others competed for attention, Michael lingered in moments. He learned that people revealed more in what they did not say than in what they did. Silence, once again, spoke. At home, words remained scarce. Henry returned each evening, his presence solid but distant. He and Michael shared meals, shared space, shared an understanding that did not require conversation. Love existed between them, but it lived quietly, like something fragile that might break if handled too directly. Mary filled the gaps without trying to erase them. She showed Michael how to fold laundry with care, how to notice when a kettle was about to boil, how to listen not just for sound, but for meaning. These lessons were never spoken aloud. They were demonstrated, repeated, lived. Michael learned them well. The first signs of illness arrived quietly, as if even sickness respected the rhythm of the house. Mary rested more often. Her movements slowed, almost imperceptibly at first. She sat longer at the kitchen table, her hands folded loosely, her gaze drifting toward the window Michael loved so well. She smiled the same way she always had, but something in her eyes began to recede, as though she were already moving away from the world. Michael noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed how the house changed when she slept during hours she once spent moving, how silence thickened rather than softened, how Henry's footsteps grew heavier, more deliberate. No one explained anything to him, no one needed to. At 9 years old, Michael understood that something essential was slipping out of reach. When Mary died, the town gathered. People filled the small rooms with murmured condolences and lowered voices. They touched Michael's head gently, as if unsure how to interact with grief that did not announce itself. He stood still, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He did not cry. He did not understand yet that some losses were too large for tears. Childhood ended that day, not with anger, not with rebellion, but with a deep internal silence that settled into him and refused to leave. And in that silence, something began to take shape. After Mary Harris died, the house did not immediately feel empty. At first, it felt suspended. Her belongings remained where she had left them. A cup still sat by the sink. A cardigan hung on the back of a chair, carrying the faint outline of her shoulders. The smell of soap lingered in the kitchen, subtle but persistent, as if the air itself had not yet accepted her absence. Michael moved through the rooms carefully, as though sound might disturb something fragile. He did not ask questions. He did not speak about his mother. He observed the way silence had changed its shape. Before, silence had felt spacious. Now it felt dense. Henry returned to work 3 days after the funeral. No discussion preceded the decision. It was simply what he did. The railways did not pause for grief, and Henry had never learned how to pause either. He left early in the mornings, his movements efficient, his face composed into something Michael had never seen before, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of tightening. Michael watched him from the doorway as he left, noticing how his father hesitated for a moment before closing the door, as though he were listening for something that no longer existed. They did not talk about Mary. They talked about food, about whether the train schedules had changed, They talked around the absence, never directly into it. Michael sensed that namming it might cause something to collapse entirely. So he remained silent. Days stretched into weeks, weeks folded into months. School continued as if nothing had happened. Teachers spoke to Michael more gently now, their voices soft in ways that made him uncomfortable. Some classmates avoided him altogether, unsure how to interact with a boy whose grief did not follow familiar patterns. Others stared, curious, as though they were waiting for him to break. He did not. Instead, he withdrew further into observation. He listened more carefully. He noticed how people used distraction as a form of protection, how laughter sometimes arrived too quickly, how silence frightened those who did not know how to live inside it. At home, Michael began to read. At first, it was accidental. A book left behind by Mary on the shelf, a collection of short stories whose pages had already softened from use. Michael picked it up one afternoon when the house felt particularly heavy, and something about the weight of it in his hands felt grounding. He read slowly. He did not yet understand all the words, but he understood the feeling of voices existing beyond his own experience. In books, silence was never empty. It carried thought, memory, regret, hope. Michael read in the evenings, sitting near the same window he had always loved. Outside, trains continued to pass. Inside, something began to open. Books did not demand response. They did not rush him. They allowed him to linger, to reread, to pause. They gave him permission to feel without explaining himself. For the first time since his mother's death, Michael felt something close to relief. Henry noticed the change, but did not comment on it. He saw the way Michael carried books from room to room, how he read at the table after dinner, his head bent low, his expression distant but calm. Henry recognized that posture. It was the same one he himself adopted while standing along the tracks, watching trains pass without boarding them. They were alike in ways neither of them fully understood. On Sundays, Henry cooked simple meals: eggs, toast, soup. He followed routines Mary had once maintained, though less gracefully. Sometimes he burned the food. Sometimes he forgot ingredients entirely. Michael never corrected him. They ate in silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was sharper now, edged with things unsaid. One evening, as they sat across from each other, Henry spoke without looking up. "She liked books," he said. Michael froze, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "Yes," Michael replied quietly. Henry nodded once, that was all. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Mary had been named, not fully, not directly, but enough to acknowledge her continued presence. Michael returned to his room that night with the strange sensation that something fragile had been preserved rather than broken. As the years passed, Michael grew taller, thinner, quieter. He learned how to move through the world without drawing attention to himself. Teachers described him as thoughtful. Neighbors described him as well-behaved. No one described him as lonely, though loneliness lived beside him like a shadow. Michael did not resent it. Loneliness, he discovered, was not always painful. Sometimes it was simply space, room to think, to observe, to exist without performance. At night, he listened to the trains and imagined his father standing somewhere along the tracks, his figure outlined against the dark. He imagined Mary sitting by another window somewhere else, watching another kind of light. These images did not comfort him exactly, but they steadied him. By the time Michael entered adolescence, restlessness had begun to take root. The town that once felt contained now felt restrictive. The streets repeated themselves. The conversations circled endlessly around the same topics. He felt himself outgrowing the boundaries without knowing what existed beyond them. Each passing train carried new weight. They were no longer just sounds in the distance. They were invitations, promises, evidence that movement was possible. Michael began to write in small notebooks he kept hidden beneath his mattress. At first, the words were fragmented: observations, images, sentences without clear direction. He did not write with intention. He wrote because something inside him needed a place to go. The notebooks became companions. He did not show them to anyone, not even Henry. High school introduced Michael to a world that expected definition. Teachers asked what he planned to become. Counselors asked about goals. Friends, if they could be called that, spoke eagerly about futures they already felt entitled to. Michael listened. He did not yet know how to answer. It was in a literature class during his second year that something shifted. The teacher, a woman with tired eyes and an unexpectedly gentle voice, returned an essay Michael had written about a novel none of the other students seemed to care about. She asked him to stay after class. Michael waited, his notebook closed in front of him, his heart beating faster than usual. "You see things," she said finally. Michael did not respond. "You notice what others move past," she continued. "That's not common." For the first time, someone had named the thing that set him apart without dismissing it. That recognition did not change his life immediately. It did not solve his loneliness or quiet his restlessness, but it planted something fragile and essential, the idea that his way of moving through the world had value, that his silence contained something worth hearing. When Michael left the classroom that day, the town looked the same. The streets were unchanged. The trains still passed, but something inside him had shifted direction. For the first time, he considered the possibility that leaving might not mean abandoning himself. By the time Michael reached his mid-teens, the idea of leaving had become less of a thought and more of a presence. It sat beside him during classes, followed him home in the afternoons, waited quietly as he lay awake at night listening to the trains. Leaving was no longer abstract. It had weight, shape, direction. The town had not changed, or perhaps it had, and Michael was the one who could no longer see it the same way. The same low houses lined the same dusty roads. The same people passed each other with familiar nods, their conversations predictable, their lives arranged within boundaries they had learned not to question. The station still stood at the edge of town, its paint faded, its benches worn smooth by waiting bodies that never stayed long. Michael walked there often. He did not board the trains. He stood at a distance, watching the doors open and close, watching faces appear briefly and then disappear again. He imagined destinations not as places, but as states of being, somewhere quieter, somewhere larger, somewhere he might finally unfold. At school, his notebooks grew thicker. What had begun as scattered observations became something closer to intention. Michael wrote about the town without naming it, about houses that crouched under the sky, about people who learned to speak only when necessary. He wrote about silence not as absence, but as substance, something that could be shaped, carried, endured. He never used the word grief. Instead, he wrote about weight, about rooms that felt heavier after certain departures, about chairs that remembered bodies long after they were empty. Writing did not make him feel understood, it made him feel aligned. Henry noticed the restlessness long before Michael acknowledged it himself. His son lingered less at home. He returned later in the evenings, his mind elsewhere even when his body was present. Henry recognized the signs. He had carried them himself once, though he had never learned what to do with them. One evening, after dinner, Henry spoke. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked, his voice neutral, almost casual. Michael hesitated. He had not expected the question. He searched for the right response and found none. "Yes," he said finally. Henry nodded. He did not look surprised. "Trains don't stop forever," he said. "They're not meant to." Michael understood that this was permission, offered in the only language his father knew how to use. They did not discuss plans. They did not discuss fear. They sat together in silence afterward, the kind that no longer pressed down but stretched outward, leaving room for possibility. The literature teacher continued to encourage Michael, though she did so carefully, never pushing, never demanding. She returned his essays with quiet notes in the margins, questions more than corrections. She introduced him to writers who lingered rather than declared, whose power lived in restraint. Michael devoured them. He began to understand that writing was not about speaking louder than others, but about listening longer, about trusting the spaces between sentences, about allowing meaning to arrive slowly. For the first time, he imagined a future that did not feel like escape, but like continuation. Graduation arrived without ceremony. The town marked the event the way it marked everything else, briefly, politely, without expectation. Families gathered, photographs were taken, futures were discussed in vague terms. Michael stood among his classmates, feeling both connected and distant, already half removed. That night, he packed a single suitcase. He walked through the house one last time, touching familiar surfaces lightly, not out of sentimentality, but out of acknowledgement. This place had shaped him. It had given him silence. It had taught him how to listen. He did not resent it. Henry stood by the door when Michael was ready to leave. He handed him an envelope containing money he had saved quietly over the years. "For books," he said. Michael nodded, unable to speak. They embraced briefly, awkwardly, two men who had never learned how to hold each other for long. Then Michael stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. The train waited. As it pulled away from the station, Michael watched the town recede, its edges blurring into the distance. He felt no dramatic release, no sudden clarity. Leaving did not transform him. It simply placed him somewhere else. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The city announced itself immediately. Noise arrived before meaning. Sound piled upon sound, voices overlapping, engines idling, footsteps striking pavement in uneven rhythms. Buildings rose without hesitation, stacked tightly together as if competing for attention. The air itself felt different, heavier somehow, crowded with motion. Michael stepped out of the station and stood still. People moved around him without slowing. They adjusted their paths instinctively, flowing past his hesitation as water flows around a stone. No one noticed him. No one needed to. Anonymity wrapped itself around him almost instantly, and with it came an unexpected sensation: relief. In the town, he had been known simply by existing. Here, existence required no explanation. University life unfolded quickly. Schedules were dense, classes large, conversations efficient. Michael learned how to navigate lecture halls filled with hundreds of students, each one carrying ambitions they spoke about openly and often. The professors spoke faster than he was used to, their ideas layered, compressed, delivered with urgency. Michael listened. He wrote everything down, not because he feared forgetting, but because writing slowed the world to a pace he could manage. On paper, ideas settled, they arranged themselves. Silence, however, had become rare. Even at night, the city hummed. Sirens sliced through the dark. Music drifted through thin walls. Somewhere nearby, someone was always awake, always speaking, always moving. Michael lay in his small rented room, staring at the ceiling, listening to a world that did not pause. Sleep came in fragments. Money was an immediate concern. Henry's savings helped, but not enough to erase the reality of rent, books, food. Michael found work at a cafe 2 blocks from campus, a narrow space with fogged windows and mismatched chairs. The owner spoke quickly, expected efficiency, and did not ask questions. Michael learned the job by watching. He memorized patterns, regular customers, preferred orders, the subtle signals people gave when they wanted conversation and when they wanted to be left alone. Silence, he discovered, existed even here, but it was negotiated, temporary, earned. The cafe became a place of observation. Students hunched over textbooks, couples arguing in hushed tones, older men reading newspapers they no longer trusted. Michael moved among them quietly, taking orders, delivering drinks, absorbing fragments of lives that intersected briefly and then moved on. He liked the transience of it. In the evenings, when the cafe emptied and the chairs were stacked, Michael lingered with a notebook, and a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He wrote about faces he would never see again, about conversations that dissolved before meaning could form, about the strange intimacy of serving strangers. Writing felt different here, more urgent, less contained. It was in the cafe that he met Emily. She arrived one afternoon carrying rain with her, her hair damp, her coat unbuttoned despite the chill. She smiled easily, not as performance but as reflex. When Michael took her order, she met his gaze without expectation, without urgency. "Whatever you recommend," she said. He hesitated, then named a drink. She laughed softly. "I trust you." That sentence stayed with him long after she sat down. Emily returned the next day, and the day after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. She spoke openly, filling space with stories and observations, but she never demanded response. When Michael spoke, she listened fully, as though quiet deserved the same attention as noise. Their conversations grew slowly. They spoke about books, about the city, about nothing at all. Silence settled between them easily, without discomfort. Michael recognized something familiar in that, something he had not known how to name before. Connection, he realized, did not require constant explanation. University years passed unevenly. Michael excelled academically, though he never competed for recognition. He wrote essays that lingered rather than declared, arguments built quietly, patiently. Professors noticed, though some mistook restraint for uncertainty. Emily remained constant. They walked together through the city in the evenings, moving without destination. Michael showed her the streets he preferred, the ones less crowded, less insistent. She introduced him to corners of herself he had never asked for, but received willingly. Their relationship unfolded without drama. They did not promise forever. They did not define boundaries with precision. They simply shared space, shared time, shared the understanding that presence itself could be enough. For a while, Michael believed that stability had found him. Graduation approached with the inevitability of a closing door. The city did not slow to mark the transition. Jobs were scarce, futures blurred, conversations shifted toward logistics, compromises, contingency plans. Emily spoke about opportunities elsewhere, her excitement tinged with anxiety. Michael listened, his own uncertainty deepening. Distance crept in quietly. Calls replaced conversations, messages shortened. The shared silences that once felt full now felt strained, interrupted by static and missed timing. Neither of them fought the change. They recognized it for what it was. The end arrived through a single phone call. No accusations, no raised voices, just acknowledgement. Afterward, Michael sat alone in his room, the city's noise pressing in, and understood something new. Heartbreak did not always arrive violently. Sometimes it settled in, rearranging the interior of a life without announcing itself. When he found work as an editor months later, it felt less like ambition and more like endurance. He shaped other people's words carefully, respectfully, often invisibly. The work suited him: precision, patience, control. It also allowed him to avoid confronting his own voice. Years passed. When Henry died, Michael returned to the town one final time. He sold the house, closed doors that no longer held anything inside them. With no parents, no hometown, no shared history left intact, he stepped fully into solitude. And for a long time, that was enough. The town had not changed. Or perhaps it had changed so slowly that memory refused to register the difference. The road leading in was still narrow, still bordered by dry fields that bent under the wind. The station remained small, its paint faded, its benches smoothed by decades of waiting bodies. Even the air smelled familiar: dust, metal, distance. Michael stepped off the train, carrying a single suitcase. No one greeted him. There was no one left to do so. Henry's death had been quiet, like most things in their lives. A call from a hospital 2 towns over, a voice careful with language. An explanation offered even though Michael had not asked for one. By the time he arrived, everything essential had already happened. The house stood exactly where it always had. Low, unassuming, its windows reflecting the sky without commentary. Michael unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by stillness so complete it felt deliberate. Dust rested gently on surfaces, undisturbed. The furniture remained in place, as if Henry might return at any moment, shrug off his coat, and sit without speaking. Michael did not sit. He walked through each room slowly, not searching, not avoiding. In the kitchen, a cup sat beside the sink, unwashed. In the bedroom, Henry's boots rested near the door, angled outward. Michael noticed everything. He always had. Grief did not arrive immediately. Instead, there was a sense of suspension, of being held just above emotion. The house seemed to wait with him, unwilling to move forward without acknowledgement. That night, Michael slept in his childhood room. The ceiling was lower than he remembered, the walls closer. Outside, the wind moved across the fields, carrying the same distant sounds it always had. For the first time in years, silence did not compete with noise. It simply existed. He slept deeply. The funeral was small. The town gathered out of habit more than connection. Faces had aged, names surfaced slowly, condolences were offered with efficiency, words spoken carefully but without intimacy. Michael accepted them without resistance. He did not cry. He stood near the grave and watched as the earth closed over what remained of his father. He thought of Henry's hands, scarred, reliable, exhausted. He thought of evenings spent eating in silence, of shared space mistaken for distance. He realized then that grief was not absence. It was accumulation. In the days that followed, Michael sorted through the house. He worked methodically, room by room, drawer by drawer. Objects revealed versions of Henry he had never fully known, letters never sent, tools repaired repeatedly instead of replaced, books read slowly and thoroughly. Michael understood with a quiet clarity that his father had lived the only way he knew how, steadily, without spectacle. There was no bitterness in that realization. Only recognition. Selling the house took longer than expected. Paperwork accumulated. Conversations stretched. Michael remained longer than planned, moving through the town as if walking through memory itself. Some places triggered nothing. Others carried weight unexpectedly. The window where he had watched dust float in sunlight. The tracks where trains still passed, indifferent to time. He stood near them one afternoon and felt the full shape of his childhood settle into place, not as loss, but as foundation. When the house finally sold, Michael closed the door for the last time without ceremony. He did not look back. There was nothing left to retrieve. Back in the city, life resumed without pause. Work filled his days. Routine carried him forward. He edited manuscripts, refined arguments, corrected grammar. He became reliable, invisible, essential in small ways. People trusted him with their words. He did not trust himself with his own. Years blurred together. Michael watched colleagues advance, change roles, move on. He remained. The work never offended him. It also never demanded transformation. In that stability, time passed unnoticed. Until insomnia arrived. It came without warning, settling into his nights gradually. Sleep shortened, thoughts lengthened. Michael lay awake listening to the city breathe, feeling the weight of accumulated years pressed gently but persistently. One night he reached for a notebook. Not with intention, not with ambition. With necessity. He began to write. At first, sentences arrived cautiously, observations, fragments, scenes without context. He did not correct himself, he did not reread. Writing was not performance, it was excavation. He wrote about silence, about his mother's hands moving efficiently through domestic rituals, about his father's posture at the table, about trains passing through towns without stopping, about the cafe and Emily and the way laughter could exist without explanation. Night after night, the notebook filled. Michael did not aim for meaning. Meaning emerged regardless. Writing changed him subtly. His days felt less compressed. His thoughts arranged themselves more clearly. He listened differently, not just to others, but to himself. Years passed like this. When the manuscript was finished, he did not notice. The final page arrived without announcement. Michael closed the notebook and set it aside, unsure what to do next. It sat untouched for months. Publishing was accidental. A colleague mentioned a small press. Michael submitted without expectation. He forgot about it. When acceptance arrived, it felt unreal, like news intended for someone else. The book was released quietly. No interviews, no acclaim, no rush. But letters arrived. One in particular stayed with him. A single page, careful handwriting. "You wrote what I never knew how to say." Michael read it several times. Success, he realized, was not recognition. It was resonance. As age slowed him, Michael welcomed it. He walked more, spoke less, observed without urgency. Regret softened into acceptance. He no longer measured life by absence, but by accumulation, moments held quietly, connections formed without force. On a peaceful morning in his 70s, sunlight warming the table beside him, he wrote one final sentence. "I stayed silent, but life spoke." He closed the notebook. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to add anything more. After the book was published, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden invitations, no public recognition, no sense of arrival. Life continued in the same quiet rhythm it always had. Michael still woke early. He still drank his coffee slowly. He still walked the same streets on his way to work, observing faces he would never know. And yet, something had shifted. The words he had released into the world no longer belonged entirely to him. That knowledge sat with him gently, not as pride, but as responsibility. Somewhere, someone was reading sentences he had written alone at night. Someone was holding his silence and finding their own reflection inside it. That thought followed him through his days. At work, colleagues mentioned the book occasionally, always with mild surprise. "I didn't know you wrote," they said, as if writing was something that required announcement. Michael smiled, nodded, and returned to his desk. He did not explain. Explanation felt unnecessary. The editing work changed subtly. He became more attentive to voice, not grammar, not structure, but intention. He could feel when a sentence was honest and when it was reaching. He learned to respect restraint. Not everything needed to be said loudly to be true. Authors began requesting him specifically. They described his feedback as considerate, precise, quietly perceptive. Michael accepted the work without comment, understanding that this was the shape his contribution would take. Invisible but essential. Time moved differently in middle age. Years no longer arrived as milestones, but as layers. One day blended into the next without urgency. Michael marked time by seasons instead, by light, by temperature, by the changing sound of the city. He moved apartments, not for ambition, but for comfort. He chose spaces with windows that faced east, where mornings arrived gently. He filled shelves with books he had already read, keeping them not for reference, but for companionship. Loneliness remained, but it no longer frightened him. Loneliness had become familiar, like an old room whose creaks he understood. He learned its rhythms, its boundaries. He knew when to let it speak and when to interrupt it with movement, with routine, with observation. Occasionally, he attended readings. He sat in the back. He listened more than he spoke when people recognized him. It was often with hesitation, as though unsure whether he belonged to the noise of public life. Michael reassured them with his presence alone. He did not disappear. He simply did not insist. There were moments when memory resurfaced unexpectedly. Emily's laughter echoed once in a crowded street. Michael stopped walking, his body reacting before his mind could follow. The sound dissolved quickly, absorbed into the city. He stood still for a moment, then continued on. He did not reach for the past. He allowed it to pass through him. That, too, was a skill learned slowly. Letters continued to arrive. Not many, never in waves, but consistently. They came from people of all ages, some young, uncertain, searching, others older, reflective, nearing conclusions of their own. They wrote about silence, about restraint, about lives lived without spectacle. Michael responded to some of them. Briefly, honestly, without instruction. He never positioned himself as authority. He knew better. He had not mastered life. He had merely listened to it. One letter came from a man close to his own age. I spent my life thinking I had failed because no one noticed, it read. Your book made me understand that I was measuring myself against the wrong scale. Michael folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with others. That drawer became heavy over time. His body began to slow before his mind accepted it. Knees ached, mornings took longer. He walked shorter distances more deliberately. Doctors spoke in calm, efficient language, nothing alarming, nothing urgent. Just time. Michael welcomed the slowing. It allowed him to notice more. The way sunlight shifted across walls, the rhythm of his own breathing, the subtle changes in his thoughts, less restless, more reflective, regret, once sharp, softened into understanding. Decisions he had questioned no longer demanded justification. He had lived the only way he knew how. And it had been enough. One afternoon, while walking through a park, Michael sat on a bench and watched a child struggle to read aloud from a book. The child stumbled, grew frustrated, tried again. A parent waited patiently, offering neither correction nor pressure. Michael smiled. He recognized something deeply familiar in the scene. Learning, he thought, was not about speed. It was about permission. At home that evening, he opened a new notebook. Not to begin another book, but to continue listening. He wrote about time, not as enemy, not as loss, but as companion, about aging as an accumulation of understanding rather than decline, about the quiet courage required to remain present without demand. The words came slowly. That was how he liked them. Recognition arrived the way everything else in Michael's life had arrived, without urgency, without announcement, and without spectacle. It began with invitations. Small ones at first, local readings, panel discussions at modest venues, requests from libraries and universities that had discovered his book not through marketing but through recommendation, one reader speaking to another, a slow but deliberate transmission. Michael accepted some. He declined others. Not out of indifference, but discernment. He learned to recognize when participation would add meaning and when it would simply add noise. Public life, he understood, did not have to be total to be valid. At his first reading, he stood behind a simple wooden podium. The room was half full, the lighting was soft, people sat with notebooks or folded hands, waiting without expectation. Michael read slowly, deliberately. He allowed pauses. He did not fill silence. When he finished, no one rushed to speak. Then applause arrived, not loud, not prolonged, but sincere. Michael nodded once and stepped back. That was enough. Readers approached him afterward. They spoke quietly, as though afraid to disturb something delicate. Some thanked him, some told brief stories of their own lives, others simply shook his hand and left without explanation. Michael listened. He learned that recognition did not mean being seen by many. It meant being seen by those who were ready. He remained an editor. Despite encouragement to write more, to publish again, to capitalize on momentum, Michael resisted urgency. He continued writing privately, allowing ideas to mature without pressure. Words, he believed, deserved patience. At work, younger editors sought his guidance. They asked about clarity, about restraint, about when to stop revising. Michael offered practical advice, but also something else, permission to trust intuition. He reminded them that not every sentence needed to impress. Some listened, others moved on. Both outcomes felt acceptable. Time thinned his social circle naturally. People moved away, retired, fell ill, disappeared gradually. Michael did not resist this narrowing. He understood that depth often arrived as width receded. Friendships that remained grew quieter, more intentional. Conversations centered less on plans and more on reflection. Laughter softened, silence lengthened. Michael appreciated the honesty of this stage. Nothing needed to become anything else. One afternoon, he received a letter unlike the others. It came from a woman in her 20s. She wrote about feeling invisible, about measuring herself against expectations she did not believe in, about the exhaustion of constant performance. Michael recognized the tone immediately, not despair, but confusion. He wrote back carefully. He did not offer solutions. He wrote, "You do not need to become louder to be real. Some lives speak in subtler ways." Weeks later, another letter arrived. "Thank you," it said. "I am learning to listen." Michael placed the letter in the drawer. It was nearly full now. His body continued its quiet negotiations with age. He adjusted routines, took longer walks, fewer stairs. He paid attention to fatigue. He did not resent it. The body, like the mind, carried history. Doctors spoke of maintenance. Michael listened. Occasionally, memories of Emily returned, not as longing, but as acknowledgement. He wondered where she was, what life had shaped her into. He did not search. Some stories were meant to remain incomplete. He believed that now. Late one evening, after a reading at a small community center, a man approached him hesitantly. "I didn't know books could sound like that," the man said. Michael asked what he meant. "Like someone was finally speaking my pace." Michael nodded. That night he walked home slowly, the city quieting around him. He realized that his work had found its place, not at the center of attention, but at the edges, where people listened more carefully. That was where he had always belonged. The horizon did not shrink as Michael aged. It slowed. Distances remained the same, but his relationship to them changed. What once felt urgent now felt optional. What once demanded response now invited contemplation. Time no longer chased him, it walked beside him. Mornings became his favorite part of the day. He woke early, not out of obligation, but habit. The city at that hour felt honest, streets quieter, movements unperformed. He brewed coffee carefully, the routine itself a form of meditation. Steam rose, light entered the room gradually. Michael watched without impatience. His apartment had grown simpler over the years. Fewer objects, fewer distractions, everything present had earned its place. Books lined one wall, not arranged by importance, but by memory. Each spine carried a season of his life. He did not reread often. He liked knowing they were there. Walking replaced ambition. He walked not to arrive, but to remain in motion. His pace slowed naturally. At first, this frustrated him. Later, he learned to accept it. Slowness revealed details speed concealed, cracks in sidewalks, reflections in windows, conversations overheard without context. He felt less separate from the world than he ever had. His body required negotiation now. Pain arrived without invitation, lingered without explanation. Michael learned to listen, to distinguish between resistance and harm. He adjusted, he rested, he forgave himself for limitations he had once dismissed. Doctors spoke of age clinically. Michael experienced it personally. He noticed how memories softened, sharp edges rounded. Events that once felt defining now appeared as part of a broader pattern. Even grief lost its urgency, becoming a quiet companion rather than an occupying force. He thought often of his parents, not with longing, with clarity. Teaching entered his life unexpectedly. A small university invited him to lead a short seminar on writing and observation. Michael hesitated. He had never considered himself a teacher. He accepted only after confirming there would be no grading, no competition. The classroom was small. Students arrived uncertain, some eager, some guarded. Michael spoke little. He asked them to describe ordinary moments without explanation, to observe without interpreting, to write what was present, not what they wished to present. Some struggled. Some resisted. A few understood immediately. Michael did not separate success from failure. He understood learning as uneven, personal. He watched students discover patience, sometimes with writing, sometimes with themselves. On the final day, a student said, "You never tell us what's right." Michael smiled. "I don't know," he replied. "I only know what's honest." Evenings grew quieter. Social invitations became infrequent, and Michael did not miss them. He learned the difference between isolation and peace. Silence, once protective, now felt expansive. He wrote less, but when he did, it felt essential. Notebooks filled slowly. No deadlines, no structure, just accumulation. He wrote about agging without fear, about love without possession, about the courage required to remain gentle in a world that rewarded urgency. Sometimes he wondered if there would be another book. He did not answer the question. One afternoon, while resting on a bench near the river, Michael watched the water move steadily past him. It did not hurry, it did not pause. It accepted obstacles and reshaped itself around them. He recognized something familiar in that movement. Life, he realized, was not something to be solved. It was something to be accompanied. That evening, he wrote a single sentence. "Time did not take from me, it taught me how to carry." He closed the notebook. As Michael moved further into his later years, the question of legacy appeared, not as ambition, but as curiosity. He did not ask what he would leave behind. He asked what would remain without effort. The answer surprised him. It was not his book, though it continued to circulate quietly. It was not his profession, though his influence lingered in the work of others. What endured were moments, unremarkable on the surface, but deeply imprinted on those who experienced them. A sentence read at the right time. A pause that allowed understanding. A presence that did not demand. Michael began to understand legacy not as monument, but as echo. His days simplified further. He sold his apartment and moved to a smaller one near the edge of the city, where trees outnumbered buildings and mornings arrived without resistance. The move felt less like retreat and more like alignment. Neighbors greeted him politely. Some learned his name. Others did not. Both felt appropriate. He established routines that honored his energy: short walks, long rests, reading slowly, writing sparingly. He learned to accept help without embarrassment, a skill that had taken decades to develop. Independence, he realized, did not require isolation. Letters arrived less frequently now. Some writers had moved on, some had settled, some no longer needed words to hold them. Michael felt no loss in this. The silence that returned felt earned. One letter arrived unexpectedly from a former student. "I teach now," it said. "I hear your voice when I pause instead of correcting." Michael smiled. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer, now nearly full. He understood then that teaching had continued beyond the classroom, beyond intention. That was how meaning moved. His health declined gently. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden alarms, just gradual adjustments. He spent more time indoors. He learned to rest without guilt. He listened closely to his body, respecting its limitations as he once respected silence. Doctors spoke in softer tones now. Michael listened. Memory became selective. Certain images returned often, dust floating in sunlight, his mother's hands, trains moving through open land. Other memories faded entirely. He did not resist the fading. What remained felt essential. He thought less about mistakes, more about presence. One evening, while organizing his notebooks, Michael reread sections of his early writing. He noticed the tension, the restraint, the searching. He felt no embarrassment, only compassion for the man he had been. He had not known then what he knew now. That was not failure. That was time. He wrote less frequently now, but more precisely. One afternoon, he wrote, "I once believed life required explanation. Now I know it requires attention." He closed the notebook and rested his hands on the cover, feeling the weight of years contained within pages. Old age did not arrive suddenly. It entered Michael's life the way everything meaningful had, gradually, almost apologetically, asking little and changing much. There was no clear moment when he thought, "I am old now." Instead, there were small recognitions, the way his reflection startled him briefly before becoming familiar again, the way afternoons asked for rest without negotiation, the way memory no longer obeyed command. The light changed first. Not in brightness, but in quality. Mornings felt softer, as though filtered through something unseen. Shadows lingered longer. Evenings arrived earlier, not impatiently, but with certainty. Michael adjusted his routines accordingly, honoring the rhythm instead of resisting it. He learned to sit still for long periods. At first, this felt like surrender. Later, it felt like permission. His apartment grew quieter. The sounds that once filled it, music, radio, the hum of distant traffic, were gradually replaced by absence. Michael did not experience this as loss. Silence, after all, had always been his native language. In its depth, he found clarity rather than emptiness. He spent hours by the window. From there, he watched the world continue without him. Children grew taller, neighbors aged, seasons turned without commentary. Michael understood that observation, too, was participation. He was still here. That was enough. Visitors became rare but meaningful. A former colleague stopped by occasionally, bringing bread and conversation in equal measure. A neighbor checked in quietly, never overstaying. A nurse arrived weekly, efficient and kind, careful not to rush him. Michael appreciated their restraint. He had lived long enough to understand that presence did not require performance. Memory became fluid. Some days the past arrived uninvited, vivid, and complete. Other days it receded entirely, leaving only impressions, feelings without images, names without faces. Michael learned not to chase recollection. What returned did so for a reason. He thought often of his mother. Not of her illness, but of her movements, the quiet certainty with which she navigated the world. He recognized her influence everywhere in his life, in his patience, in his attentiveness, in his refusal to impose. His father appeared less frequently in memory now, but when he did, it was with warmth rather than distance. Michael finally understood the man's silences not as absence, but as effort. That understanding arrived late, but not too late. Writing slowed almost to a stop. Michael no longer felt the need to record everything. The act of living itself felt complete. Still, he kept a notebook nearby, not out of habit, but out of respect, for the possibility that something essential might still need saying. Most days, the notebook remained closed. And that felt right. One afternoon, during a rare moment of clarity that felt sharper than usual, Michael walked slowly to the small desk by the window and opened the notebook. He did not think. He wrote. Not about the past. Not about regret. Not about meaning. He wrote about listening. About how life had spoken to him in pauses rather than proclamations. About how silence had shaped him more fully than instruction ever could. About how a quiet life was not a small one. The words came without resistance. When he finished, He did not reread them. He trusted them. As days shortened, Michael's body weakened gently. Sleep occupied more hours, waking felt heavier, and yet there was no fear, only a sense of nearing something familiar, something patient. He was not waiting for an ending. He was completing a sentence. One morning, sunlight rested on the table beside him. It was warm. Michael opened his notebook one last time and wrote a single line, carefully, deliberately. I stayed silent, but life spoke. He closed the book. He did not feel the need to add anything more. Michael Harris passed quietly as he had lived. There was no announcement, no audience, no summary of achievements. A few people noticed his absence, a few more felt it without knowing why. His book remained. Not widely known, not loudly praised, but present. In libraries, on shelves, in hands that needed it. And in that way, without spectacle, without excess, his life continued to speak.